Why are you still here? The voice, thin and sharp as a shard of ice, sliced through the funereal hum of the grand ballroom. Beatrice Vance stood with the rigid posture of a woman who believed her spine was forged from a superior metal. Her black dress was less a garment of mourning and more a declaration of severe, architectural wealth. She wasn't looking at Alara, not directly. She was addressing a space near Alara's shoulder, as if the woman herself was merely a smudge on the air that needed wiping away. "Your services," Beatrice continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried farther than a shout, "are concluded. Don't linger where you're no longer needed." Alara didn't flinch. She had spent the last decade of her life in this house, in this world of polished surfaces and unpolished emotions, and had long ago learned that stillness was a form of armor. Her attention remained fixed on the man seated beside her, Arthur Vance, the family patriarch, now a ghost haunting the wake of his own wife. His hand, a fragile map of protruding veins and paper-thin skin, trembled in hers. He was staring at a towering arrangement of white lilies, but his eyes were seeing a different time, a different room, a life that had been packed away and stored in the attic of his memory. This event wasn't a memorial, it was a merger. The air didn't smell of sorrow but of expensive perfume and the faint, metallic tang of ambition. Men in dark, tailored suits spoke in hushed tones, but their conversations were of market caps and leveraged buyouts, not of Eleanor Vance's laugh or the specific shade of blue of her eyes. Champagne flutes clicked with a brittle cheerfulness that felt obscene. They were burying a woman and her entire era, and they were doing it with ruthless efficiency. Alara's presence was a loose thread in this tightly woven tapestry of corporate grief. She wasn't family. She wasn't an investor. She was, in the cold calculus of this room, a former asset. The caregiver. For 10 years she had been Eleanor's shadow, her confidante, her hands when they grew too frail, and her memory when it began to fray. And after Eleanor's passing, she had stayed not for payment but for him. Arthur. He was the last piece of a promise she had made. Beatrice took a step closer, her gaze finally snagging on Alara's simple gray dress. It was clean, respectful, and utterly out of place among the couture labels that populated the room. "He has nurses now," Beatrice hissed, her perfectly sculpted lips barely moving. "Professionals. You are a sentimental redundancy." A sentimental redundancy. The phrase hung in the air, clinical and cruel. Alara felt a familiar, dull ache behind her ribs. It was the pain of being seen but not recognized, of being essential one moment and disposable the next. She thought of the nights she'd spent reading poetry to Eleanor, the afternoons listening to Arthur's stories of their courtship, the quiet, sacred trust they had placed in her. To Beatrice, all of that was just a service rendered, a contract fulfilled. Would you endure this? To have a decade of your life, of your heart, dismissed as a line item on an expense report? Alara met Beatrice's gaze. Her own eyes were calm, her voice soft but clear, carrying the quiet authority that had soothed a dying woman and could steady a grieving man. "Mr. Vance is unsettled." "I am not a service, Mrs. Vance. I am a familiar face." For a moment, Beatrice looked as if she'd been slapped. The idea that a person in Alara's position could possess an identity beyond her function was an affront to the natural order of her universe. Her eyes narrowed into icy slits. "See that he remains quiet. My husband is about to speak. We don't need any distractions." She turned and glided away, a black swan returning to her flock of predators, leaving a wake of chilled air behind her. Alara tightened her grip on Arthur's hand. He turned his head slowly, his cloudy eyes finally finding hers. A flicker of something, recognition, fear, a deep and bottomless sorrow, passed through them. "She's gone, isn't she, Alara?" he whispered, his voice raspy with disuse. Alara's heart constricted. He hadn't spoken a full sentence all day. "Yes, Arthur," she said gently, her voice a low, soothing hum. "She is." He leaned his head back, a single tear tracing a path through the weathered landscape of his cheek. In the center of the room, his son, Julian Vance, stepped up to a podium, tapping a microphone. The businesslike chatter subsided, replaced by an expectant hush. Julian, a man who wore his father's features but none of his warmth, cleared his throat. He was about to deliver a eulogy for his mother, but his eyes were scanning the room, assessing the audience, counting the cameras. It was a performance. And Alara, the sentimental redundancy, the smudge on the air, sat in the shadow of the stage, holding the hand of the only man in the room who was truly mourning. She was invisible, and in this house, that had always been her strength. But tonight, for the first time, it felt like a cage. She knew things about Eleonora's final wishes, secrets whispered in the quiet hours of the night that this polished, ambitious family had already decided to forget. And the weight of that knowledge was a heavy, silent burden. Julian's voice, amplified and smooth, washed over the room. He spoke of legacy, of vision, of adapting to a new century. He called his mother a titan and a pioneer, but the words were hollow, polished stones dropped into a deep well. He was eulogizing her brand, not her soul. Elara watched Beatrice, who looked upon her husband with a raptor's proprietary pride. This was their moment, their ascension. Eleonora's death was the final obstacle removed. Arthur began to fidget. The microphone's feedback squealed for a second, and the sound physically pained him. He tugged at his collar, his breath coming in shallow, panicked bursts. Elara instinctively moved to shield him, her body a small bulwark against the overwhelming sensory input of the room. She leaned in, whispering the opening lines of a Wordsworth poem Eleonora had loved, a little ritual of calm they had shared. As she shifted, a small, neatly folded square of white linen slipped from the sleeve pocket of her dress and fluttered to the polished floor. It lay there for a moment, stark against the dark, gleaming wood. Before Elara could retrieve it, Beatrice, who had the uncanny ability to sense any deviation from her script, was there. Her eyes, which had been fixed adoringly on her husband, now locked onto the small white object with laser-like focus. She bent, not with grace, but with a stiff, resentful angle at the waist, and picked it up between her thumb and forefinger as if it were a contaminated specimen. She held it aloft. The handkerchief was old, the linen softened by 1,000 washings, the edges delicately hemmed. In one corner, stitched in a faded blue thread that was almost the color of a twilight sky, were the initials E.V. "Must you drop your rags everywhere?" Beatrice's voice was a low, venomous thing, meant only for Elara, but several nearby guests turned their heads. The public misjudgment was escalating from a private whisper to a semi-public shaming. Elara rose slowly, her hand outstretched. Her face remained a mask of calm, but inside, a cold anger was stirring. That handkerchief had been a gift from Eleonora, given to her on a difficult day years ago. "A lady always has two," Eleonora had said with a wink. "One for her own tears and one to offer a friend." It was more than a piece of cloth. It was a symbol of a bond that Beatrice could never comprehend. "May I have it back, please?" Elara asked, her voice even. Beatrice's lips curled into a sneer. "It belongs in the laundry or the trash." She made a move to toss it toward a passing waiter's tray, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. "No," the word was not from Elara. It was a choked, desperate sound from Arthur. He was struggling to rise from his chair, his eyes fixed on the handkerchief in Beatrice's hand. A profound, agonizing recognition was fighting its way through the fog of his mind. He saw the faded initials, and for a split second, the man he used to be looked out from behind his vacant eyes. The room, the speeches, the corporate mourners all vanished for him. There was only that small piece of linen and the lifetime of love it represented. Beatrice froze, momentarily thrown by her father-in-law's outburst. In that instant of hesitation, Elara stepped forward and gently but firmly took the handkerchief from her grasp. She didn't look at Beatrice. Her focus was entirely on Arthur. She refolded the cloth with deliberate, respectful motions and tucked it securely back into her pocket. She then placed a soothing hand on Arthur's arm, easing him back into his seat. The entire exchange took less than 10 seconds, but a line had been crossed. Beatrice's face was a thunderous mask of fury. She had been publicly countermanded, however subtly, by the help. The humiliation was, in her mind, unforgivable. She shot Elara a look that promised consequences, a silent declaration of war. What she didn't see, what no one but Elara saw, was the tear that slipped from Arthur's eye as he watched the handkerchief disappear back into Elara's pocket, a tear not of confusion but of profound loss. The object was a key, and Beatrice had just tried to throw it away. Julian concluded his remarks with a flourish, announcing the formal launch of the Vance Forward Foundation. A sleek video presentation filled the screens flanking the stage, showcasing stock images of smiling, diverse children and gleaming laboratories. The graphics were stunning, the branding impeccable. It was a foundation, Alara thought, that looked like it had been designed by an algorithm to maximize the appearance of compassion. "My mother's philanthropic spirit was legendary," Julian announced, his voice resonating with rehearsed sincerity. But her methods, bless her heart, were of a different time, personal, analog. The Vance Forward Foundation will streamline her passions, leveraging data and strategic partnerships to create a truly global impact. We are moving from the heart to the head. It's what she would have wanted. The lie was so audacious it almost took Alara's breath away. Eleonora had despised committees and data points. Her charity was intimate, direct. It was a check written to a promising student, a call made to secure a hospital bed for a gardener's sick wife, a fund established to ensure the children of her staff could go to college. It was a charity of the heart, and Julian had just publicly declared its obsolescence. The crowd applauded politely. As they began to disperse for more champagne, Alara guided Arthur toward a quieter anteroom, away from the noise. It was there, near a service corridor, that she overheard the two family lawyers, their voices low and self-congratulatory. "Brilliant move with the omnibus clause," the older one said, sipping his drink. "Nullifying all prior informal bequests in one clean stroke, avoids 1,000 messy little claims." "The staff codicil was the main one," the younger one replied. "The education fund," Julian was adamant, "called it a sentimental liability. Legally, it's like it never existed now." They chuckled, a dry, rustling sound of corporate satisfaction. Alara felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. It's gone. The promise she'd made to Eleonora in her final weeks, whispered between sips of water and morphine doses. "See to the fund, Alara. Don't let the boys forget the people who hold this house up. It's my real legacy." This was the no-way-back moment. This wasn't just a slight, or a matter of Beatrice's cruelty. This was the deliberate, legal erasure of a dying woman's most fervent wish. It was an act of profound violence against her memory. Julian hadn't just streamlined his mother's legacy, he had gutted it, sold it for parts, and mounted the shiny hood ornament on his new corporate foundation. The weight of her promise settled on her not as a burden but as a mandate. She had no power, no money, no status. She was, as Beatrice had so helpfully pointed out, a sentimental redundancy. But she had been a witness. She held the truth, and in her pocket she carried a small piece of linen stitched with the initials of the woman they were trying to erase. What would you do next if you were in her shoes? Stay silent and protect yourself, or speak up and risk everything for a promise made to the dead. For Alara, there was no choice at all. She had to fight. The question was how. The next morning, a formal dismissal notice arrived via courier. It was cold, efficient, and included a generous severance check, which felt less like compensation and more like a bribe for her silence. She was given 48 hours to vacate the small but comfortable room she occupied in the staff wing of the estate. The act of packing was a strange and painful ritual. She was dismantling a decade of her life, folding it into cardboard boxes. The work was methodical, unhurried. It was in her nature to bring order to chaos, a skill she had honed at Eleonora's bedside. She was more than a caregiver. She had been the curator of a life as it wound down, organizing correspondence, photographs, and personal effects with a gentle and meticulous hand. The last box to be packed was a heavy one, filled with Eleonora's personal journals. Julian's assistant had sent a curt email requesting they be collected for the family archives. Alara knew they would likely be stored in a climate-controlled vault, their contents never to be read, their sentimental value converted into a sterile, catalogued asset. Before sealing the box, she paused. She laid the journals out on the floor, dozens of them, bound in leather of varying colors. She didn't open them, that would have been a violation of the deepest trust, but she organized them. She didn't just stack them chronologically. She created a small, handwritten index card for the box, noting periods of particular interest she recalled from her time with Eleonora. 1998, garden renovation and correspondence with landscape architect R. Ojda. 2005, trip to Kyoto, reflections on Wabi Sabi. 2019, initial discussions of staff education codicil, Meetings with Attorney M. Gable. Her competence was quiet, innate. It was the work of an archivist, a historian, not just a caregiver. When the junior paralegal arrived to collect the box, a young man with nervous eyes and a suit that didn't quite fit, he found her taping it shut. "Mrs. Vance's journals, ma'am," he said, avoiding her gaze. "They are here," Alara replied, gesturing to the box. "I've included a small finding aid inside. It should help the archivist." The paralegal, whose name was David, looked confused. He picked up the box, glancing at the neat label she had affixed to the top. He saw the index card taped inside the flap. His eyes scanned the precise handwriting, the clear, logical organization. He looked from the card to Alara, then back again. A flicker of surprised respect crossed his face. "You did this?" he asked, a note of awe in his voice. "The partners have been trying to piece together the history of that codicil for weeks." He pointed to the last entry she'd made. "Attorney M. Gable. He retired 5 years ago. No one thought to look that far back." "Mrs. Vance had a long memory," Alara said simply. David stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time. She wasn't just the quiet woman who brought Mrs. Vance her tea. There was a depth, an intelligence there that the Vance family had utterly failed to perceive. He saw the quiet competence, the hidden skill. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. This is incredibly helpful." He hefted the box and turned to leave, but paused at the door. "For what it's worth," he said, his voice dropping low, "what they're doing is wrong. The way they talk about her projects, it isn't right." It was a small crack of light in a dark room. A single ally, however powerless, had noticed. As he left, Alara felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her knowledge was her only weapon, and she had just passed the first piece of ammunition to someone on the inside. Her last afternoon on the estate felt like a dream. The sun was warm, the gardens bursting with the late summer roses that Eleonora had so lovingly cultivated. Alara found Arthur on his favorite bench, overlooking the small koi pond. One of his professional nurses sat nearby, scrolling through her phone, utterly disengaged. Arthur was having a bad day. He was agitated, his hands twisting in his lap, his murmurs nonsensical and distressed. He was lost in the labyrinth of his own mind, and every path led to a dead end of confusion and fear. The nurse glanced up, sighed with exasperation, and made a note on a digital chart. Alara walked over, her footsteps silent on the grass. The nurse looked up, her expression a mixture of annoyance and surprise. "He's fine," she said dismissively, "just a bit of sundowning." Alara ignored her. She sat beside Arthur on the bench, not speaking, simply sharing the space with him. She waited for him to acknowledge her, but he seemed not to notice. His agitation grew, his breathing becoming more ragged. He began to pluck at the fabric of his trousers, a low moan escaping his lips. Slowly, deliberately, Alara reached into her pocket and took out the handkerchief. She unfolded it carefully, the soft linen releasing its faint, stored scent of lavender and thyme. She didn't offer it to him. She simply held it in her own hands, letting the familiar aroma mingle with the scent of the roses. The effect was gradual, then total. Arthur's frantic movements stilled. His head, which had been darting from side to side, turned toward her. His eyes, cloudy and unfocused moments before, sharpened. He stared at the handkerchief. His nostrils flared slightly, taking in the scent. It was a scent that had been woven into the fabric of his life for 60 years. It was the scent of his wife's pillow, her favorite sweater, her presence. He reached out a trembling hand, not for the handkerchief itself, but for her hand that held it. His fingers, cool and dry, brushed against hers. Then, with a tenderness that was heartbreaking to witness, he touched the corner of the cloth, his thumb tracing the faded blue threads of the stitched initials. "E.V. "Eleonora," he whispered. The name was a prayer. A key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for months. A wave of memory, so powerful and clear, washed over him, and his entire body seemed to relax, the tension draining away like a receding tide. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the bench, a look of profound peace settling on his features. The nurse was staring, her phone forgotten in her lap, her mouth slightly agape. She had seen a change in her patient that no drug, no therapy, no professional technique had been able to elicit. She had just witnessed a quiet, inexplicable miracle. If you were there, would you step closer or stay silent? Alara felt a deep, affirming warmth spread through her chest. This was her power. Not the power of lawyers or contracts, but the power of memory, of love, of quiet, unyielding care. The handkerchief wasn't just a rag. It was a conduit. It was a bridge back to the man he had been, and a testament to the woman he had lost. In that moment, she knew that whatever happened, she could not let that memory be erased. It was Arthur's last anchor to the world, and she was its keeper. 2 days later, David, the young paralegal, called her. His voice was hushed, nervous. He asked to meet at a small, anonymous coffee shop miles from the glittering orbit of the Vance empire. He arrived looking harried, clutching a worn leather briefcase to his chest. He kept glancing over his shoulder as if he expected one of the firm's partners to materialize behind him. "I shouldn't be here," he said, sliding a plain manila folder across the table. "If they find out, I'm fired. Disbarred, maybe." "Then why are you here, David?" Alara asked gently, her eyes calm and steady. "Because of that index card you made," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "And because my grandmother was a housekeeper her whole life. I know what it's like to be invisible." He tapped the folder. "This is what they did. This is how they did it." Alara opened the folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a copy of the final page of the estate's probate filing. David had highlighted one section. It was dense with legalese, a thicket of impenetrable jargon, but one clause stood out, stark and brutal. Clause 17, Section D. The establishment of the Vance Forward Foundation, as the primary and sole philanthropic vehicle of the Vance estate, hereby supersedes, nullifies, and renders permanently void all prior codicils, addendums, verbal promises, informal bequests, or standing arrangements of a charitable nature not explicitly incorporated into its charter. "It's a kill switch," David explained, his finger tracing the words. "It's designed to wipe the slate clean." Julian's lawyers argued that consolidating everything into the new foundation was the most responsible way to honor his mother's charitable intent while protecting the estate from frivolous claims. "The education fund wasn't a frivolous claim," Alara stated. "It wasn't a question." "Of course not," David agreed, his voice laced with frustration. "It was hand-signed, notarized, and witnessed." "But that was 5 years ago. Attorney Gable, the one you mentioned, retired. The original witness, the estate manager, died last year. The only physical copy of the codicil was in Eleonora's private safe." He sighed, leaning back. "A safe that is now empty." The trap was laid bare. It wasn't just a corporate decision, it was a meticulously planned demolition. They had waited until the key players were gone from the board, then used the legal force of the new foundation to retroactively erase the old one. It was a perfect crime, committed in broad daylight with the full blessing of the law. "What can be done?" Alara asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. "Legally, nothing," David said, his expression grim. "The probate is sealed. The clause is airtight. Without the original, hand-signed codicil to present to a judge and a primary witness to its signing, it's just a memory, and memories have no standing in court." The choice was framed in stark, unforgiving terms. She could comply with the law, accept her severance, and let Eleonora's legacy die. In doing so, she would lose her dignity, her promise, the very essence of the trust Eleonora had placed in her. Or she could resist, fight a battle she had no legal way of winning, and risk whatever security she had left. Have you ever seen a rule used like a weapon? This clause wasn't a rule, it was a guillotine, and it had fallen cleanly, severing the past from the future. The system had protected itself, and she was on the outside, with nothing but a memory and a worn piece of cloth. Armed with the terrible clarity of the kill switch clause, Alara tried to fight back through official channels. It was a lesson in the architecture of power. Every door she knocked on was politely, but firmly, closed in her face. She tried to schedule a meeting with Julian. His executive assistant, a woman with a voice as smooth and impenetrable as plexiglass, informed her that Mr. Vance's schedule is fully committed, and that all matters relating to the estate are now being handled by the Foundation's board. A board, Alara knew, that was chaired by Beatrice. She called the law firm, asking for the senior partner who had praised the omnibus clause. He refused to take her call. His secretary informed her that the firm could not discuss client matters with third parties. She was a third party now, an outsider. She even reached out to a cousin of Eleanor's, a woman who had spoken at the memorial about their shared childhood. The woman listened patiently, then said with a sigh, "My dear, it's Julian's money now. What's done is done. We mustn't cause a fuss." The system was pushing back, its walls seamless and solid. Even David, her one small crack of light, went dark. He sent her a single terse text message: "They know I met with you. I can't talk anymore. I'm sorry." He too was a victim of the system he served. The isolation was crushing. She was a ghost now, haunting the periphery of a world that had moved on without her. The Vance's rationale, as it filtered through the society pages and financial news, was seductive in its pragmatism. Julian was being hailed as a visionary, a modern philanthropist shaking off the sentimental dust of the past. No one questioned the narrative. No one asked about the people, the cooks, the maids, the gardeners, whose children had just lost their chance at a better future. The final, most painful blow came from Beatrice. A letter arrived, not from a lawyer, but from Beatrice herself, written on thick, creamy stationery bearing the Vance family crest. "It has come to my attention," the letter began, "that you have been making inquiries regarding my late mother-in-law's affairs. I am sure you believe your actions are born of loyalty, but you are, in fact, causing a great deal of distress to the family, particularly to Arthur. His recent episodes of confusion have worsened since your departure. For his sake, and for yours, I must insist that you cease this crusade. Your connection to this family is over. Please allow us to grieve and to move forward." The letter was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive cruelty. It weaponized Alara's love for Arthur against her, framing her fight for justice as an act of harm. It was designed to make her feel small, foolish, and selfish. For a single, dark evening, it worked. Alara sat in her small, quiet apartment, the letter in her hand, the severance check still on her table, and felt the weight of an absolute and final defeat. What would you sacrifice to stay true? She had sacrificed her job, her home, her peace of mind. And for what? For a memory no one else seemed to care about. She unfolded the handkerchief, laying it flat on the table. The stitched EV looked up at her. She thought of Eleanor's fierce, unwavering belief in the dignity of the people who served her. She remembered her promise, whispered in the dim light of the sickroom. And in the depths of her near break, a quiet vow formed. They could close every door. They could take away her access and threaten her reputation. But they could not take the truth from her, and they had underestimated her resolve. They thought she was a servant. They were about to learn she was a guardian. The vow settled into a plan. It was not a plan of legal attacks or loud confrontations. It was a plan of quiet, strategic patience, rooted in the one vulnerability the Vances had: Arthur. Alara knew the Vance Forward Foundation was set to have its official launch gala in 1 month's time. It was to be the society event of the season, a grand spectacle designed to cement Julian and Beatrice's new status as the city's preeminent philanthropic power couple. The press would be there in force, and for the sake of appearances, Arthur Vance would be required to attend. He was the living link to the family's old money legacy, a necessary prop to legitimize their new money ambitions. Alara knew he would be miserable, overstimulated, confused, and terrified, and she knew that in his distress he would call for the only two things that still brought him comfort: his wife and the woman who held the last tangible piece of her. Alara's preparation was simple. She didn't assemble evidence for a court of law. She prepared herself for a court of public opinion. She contacted a single, trusted journalist she had met through one of Eleanor's charity luncheons years ago, a woman known for her integrity and her focus on human interest stories. She didn't give her the whole story, only a piece of it. "There's a side to Eleanor Vance's legacy that's about to be forgotten," she said. "Be at the Vance Gala and keep your camera on Arthur." Next, she prepared herself. She took a portion of the severance check, the money she saw not as a bribe but as back pay for emotional damages, and bought a single, perfectly tailored dress. It was the color of a stormy sky, simple, elegant, and severe. It was not the dress of a caregiver or a servant. It was the dress of a woman who belonged in any room she chose to enter. It was her armor. Finally, she waited. She knew the call would come. It was an agonizing, nerve-wracking month. She followed the breathless media coverage of the upcoming gala. She saw photos of Beatrice in couture fittings and read interviews with Julian about his disruptive approach to charity. Every article, every photo was a small twist of the knife. It felt as if the world had already accepted the Vance's version of the truth. Then, on the night of the gala, her phone rang. The caller ID was blocked. She answered. The voice on the other end was frantic, high-pitched. It was Julian's assistant. "He needs you," the woman said, dispensing with all pleasantries. "Mr. Vance, the elder Mr. Vance, he's having an episode. The nurses can't calm him. He's causing a scene. Julian wants to know if you can come. Now." Alara took a slow, calming breath. This was it, the threshold, the proving ground. This is where everything could flip. "I will come," she said, her voice a study in composure, "on one condition." "Anything," the assistant breathed. "When I arrive, I will not be stopped at the door. I will not be taken through a service entrance. And when I go to him, I will do it alone, on the main stage after the presentation is over, in full view of everyone." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Then, a muffled conversation. Finally, the assistant's voice returned, tight with disbelief. "He agrees." "I'm on my way," Alara said and hung up. She stood, smoothed the front of her storm gray dress and picked up the only other thing she needed, the small, worn linen handkerchief. She was walking back into the lion's den, not as prey, but as the tamer. The grand ballroom of the hotel was even more opulent than the Vance estate. A sea of diamonds and designer gowns glittered under the light of a dozen crystal chandeliers. Julian was at the podium, concluding his triumphant speech about the future of philanthropy. Alara slipped in through a side door, her arrival unnoticed in the spectacle. Her gray dress allowed her to blend into the shadows, a ghost of conscience waiting in the wings. Julian finished to a thunderous applause. He and Beatrice stood together on the stage, waving, the very picture of a modern power couple. But at the side of the stage, the picture was cracking. Arthur Vance, seated in a large, throne-like chair, was visibly in distress. He was rocking back and forth, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror at the flashing cameras and the roar of the crowd. A nurse was trying to speak to him, but he pushed her away, his agitation escalating into a full-blown public breakdown. A hush began to fall over the front rows as people noticed. The applause faltered. Julian's smile tightened. Beatrice shot a venomous look toward her father-in-law. This was the PR catastrophe they had dreaded. This was Alara's cue. As arranged, a security guard discreetly cleared a path for her. She walked from the shadows into the light, her steps unhurried, her focus absolute. A murmur rippled through the crowd. "Who is that?" She ascended the small set of stairs to the stage. Julian looked at her with desperate relief, Beatrice with pure hatred. Alara ignored them both. She walked directly to Arthur. He was weeping now, deep, guttural sobs of a man completely lost. "Eleonora," he cried out, his voice cracking. "I want my Eleonora." In front of hundreds of the city's most powerful people, in front of a dozen cameras, Alara knelt beside his chair. She didn't speak. She simply reached into her clutch, took out the handkerchief, and gently, reverently unfolded it. The cloth was a small white flag of truce in a war of grief. She placed it into his trembling, outstretched hand. The effect was instantaneous and breathtaking. Arthur stopped crying. He clutched the handkerchief, bringing it to his face, inhaling the scent that was more real to him than anything else in this glittering, hollow room. And then, a miracle. A moment of pure, shocking lucidity broke through the storm of his dementia. His back straightened. His eyes, so recently wild with fear, became sharp and clear. He looked at the handkerchief, then at Alara, his gaze filled with a profound and sorrowful understanding. Then he turned his head and looked directly at his son. His voice, when he spoke, was not the weak, reedy whisper of a sick old man. It was the resonant, authoritative voice of the patriarch, the man who had built this empire. Did you feel that shift? The entire room held its breath. "The library," Arthur commanded, his voice ringing with startling power through the microphone still clipped to his lapel. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at Julian. "Section 7. The false front bookshelf, you know, the box, your mother's will, her real will." The room erupted in a collective gasp. Cameras flashed like lightning. Julian froze, his face draining of all color. Beatrice looked as if she had been turned to stone. The carefully constructed narrative of the Vance Forward Foundation, the story of a seamless, modern legacy, had just been publicly and irrevocably shattered by a ghost, awakened by the scent of lavender on a worn piece of linen. The truth, in that moment, was not written in a contract. It was held in an old man's hand. The fallout was a media supernova. The clip of Arthur Vance's lucid declaration went viral, replayed on every news channel and social media feed. "The will that spoke," one headline dubbed it. The Vance family's carefully polished image was shattered overnight. They were no longer seen as visionary philanthropists, but as callous heirs who had tried to erase a matriarch's true legacy and gaslight a vulnerable old man. Publicly shamed and cornered, Julian had no choice. With lawyers and a videographer from the press pool as witnesses, he opened the false front bookshelf in the library. Behind it was a small wall safe, and inside that safe was a locked mahogany box. The box contained exactly what Arthur had promised: Eleonora's original, hand-signed codicil establishing the education fund. Attached to it was a letter, written in her elegant, looping script. The letter was read aloud by the lead attorney, its contents more damning than any legal clause. It spoke of her deep love for the staff who had become her second family. It detailed her fear that her sons, with their focus on scale and synergy, would fail to see the value in small, human acts of grace. The codicil, she wrote, was not charity. It was a debt of honor. The legal battle was over before it began. The Vance lawyers, facing a PR nightmare and an ironclad document, advised Julian to settle. The question now was what the terms would be. They summoned Alara to the law offices, a place where just weeks before she couldn't even get a call returned. She walked into a boardroom filled with a dozen grim-faced lawyers. Julian and Beatrice sat at the far end of the table, looking diminished and pale. "Miss Alara," the senior partner began, his voice heavy with forced humility. "In light of the recent discoveries, the family is prepared to offer you a substantial settlement for your emotional distress and your role in this matter." He slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a number with 7 figures. Alara didn't even glance at it. She looked directly at Julian, her gaze not triumphant but steady and clear. What does real justice look like here? It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about punishing Julian or bankrupting the family. Revenge would have been easy. Justice, true, lasting justice, was harder. It was about rebuilding what they had torn down. "I don't want your money," she said, her voice quiet but filling the cavernous room. The distress was not mine alone. It belonged to every family that was counting on Mrs. Vance's promise. She pushed the paper back across the table. "I want 2 things. First, the Eleonora Vance Education Fund is to be restored, not as part of the new foundation, but as a separate, protected entity, funded in perpetuity exactly as she originally specified. Second," she paused, letting the weight of her next words settle, "its board of directors will include a permanent voting seat for a representative elected by the staff of the Vance estate and its holdings. Their voice will always have a place at the table." The lawyers exchanged stunned glances. Julian stared at her, a flicker of something, begrudging respect. Awe in his eyes. She hadn't asked for a fortune. She hadn't asked for an apology. She had asked for systemic change. She had asked for a promise to be kept, not just for the past, but for the future. It was a move of such quiet, strategic grace that it left them speechless. They had come prepared for a fight over money. They were not prepared for a negotiation about honor. The negotiation that followed was swift. The Vances, eager to stanch the bleeding of their public reputation, agreed to all of Alara's terms. The legal team worked around the clock, not to find loopholes, but to build fortifications. The Eleonora Vance Education Fund was formally established, its charter written into the core bylaws of the entire Vance Corporation. It was legally designated as a primary, protected bequest, shielding it from any future attempts to dissolve or absorb it. A new, system-wide policy was drafted to govern it. They called it the Eleonora Clause. It mandated that a fixed percentage of the corporation's annual profits be irrevocably directed to the fund before any other philanthropic or investment allocations were made. It was no longer a matter of choice. It was a non-negotiable cost of doing business. But the most revolutionary part of the change was the creation of the Staff Advocacy Board. This new body, with Alara unanimously voted in as its first chair, was given real power. It would not only oversee the administration of the education fund, but would also have review and common authority on any new corporate policies affecting household and service staff across all Vance properties. For the first time, the people who cleaned the floors and drove the cars had a formal, protected voice in the boardroom. Would this change be enough in your workplace? The change was not met with universal applause. There was resistance from some mid-level managers who chafed at the new oversight. Beatrice treated the entire affair as a bitter pill she was being forced to swallow, her civility a thin veneer over a core of simmering resentment. The system hadn't been magically transformed into a paradise of equality. The path forward was fraught with the quiet, persistent friction of change, but the path was open. A few weeks after the signing, Alara attended the first meeting of the new board. It was held in the same room where she had been offered hush money. This time, she wasn't an outsider petitioning for an audience. She was at the head of the table. Seated around her were the head chef, the lead gardener from the country estate, and a security supervisor who had worked for the family for 30 years. Their faces were etched with a mixture of disbelief, gravity, and a fierce, protective pride. They were no longer invisible. They were governors of a promise, and their work was just beginning. The headlines eventually faded, replaced by the next scandal, the next spectacle. The world moved on. But in the quiet gardens of the Vance estate, a deeper healing was taking place. Weeks after the new fund was established, Alara returned to the estate, not as a visitor, but as the chair of the advocacy board there to meet with staff. Her meeting ran late, and as dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of violet and rose, she walked out to the koi pond. She found Arthur there, sitting on his bench, watching the fish glide like strokes of orange ink through the dark water. He was calmer than she had seen him in years. The violent swings of his dementia had softened into a gentle, wandering fog. He looked up as she approached, and a soft, genuine smile touched his lips. "I was hoping you would come," he said, his voice quiet and clear. He patted the space on the bench beside him. She sat with him in a comfortable silence, watching the last of the light fade. His memory of the gala, of the dramatic confrontation and its aftermath, was gone, a phantom ship that had sailed over the horizon of his mind. But the core of his recognition, the emotional truth of her presence, remained. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a fresh linen handkerchief, one she had brought him on her last visit. It was a simple, unmarked one. "Eleonora," he said, his voice filled with a gentle, wistful certainty, "always said your loyalty was a rare and beautiful thing. A port in any storm." He turned to look at her, his eyes lucid and kind. "She would be so proud of you, my dear." Tears welled in Alara's eyes. This was the only verdict, the only validation that had ever mattered, not the newspaper articles praising her as a David against Goliath, not the fawning respect of the lawyers who had once dismissed her, not even the victory of restoring the fund. It was this quiet moment of recognition from the man who had loved Eleonora best. It was the closing of a circle, a personal healing far removed from the public stage, whose voice helped you heal when no one clapped. For Alara, it was his. She gently took his hand, her fingers closing over his. "She would be proud of you too, Arthur," she whispered. "You remembered her." He smiled, turning his gaze back to the pond. In that shared stillness, her dignity, which had been so publicly assailed, was privately and completely restored. She had reclaimed not just a promise, but herself. The first awards ceremony for the Eleonora Vance Education Fund was a deliberately modest affair. There was no glittering gala, no press wall, no parade of celebrities. It was held in the estate's newly refurbished library, the very room where the codicil had been hidden. The attendees were the scholarship recipients and their families, the children of the cooks, gardeners, drivers, and housekeepers, their faces bright with a future that had almost been denied them. Alara sat in the front row, not on a stage but among the families. She was not the event's hero, but its quiet guardian. When the time came for the closing remarks, Julian Vance walked to the small lectern. He looked different. The slick, corporate confidence was gone, replaced by a more sober, humbled demeanor. He looked tired, but also, for the first time, at peace. He didn't speak from notes. He looked out at the faces in the crowd, his gaze eventually landing on Alara. "A few months ago," he began, his voice steady. "I stood on a very different stage and talked about the future. I talked about data and impact and scale. I believed I was honoring my mother by making her legacy bigger, stronger, more efficient." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I was wrong. My mother's legacy was never about being big, it was about being present. She didn't value metrics, she valued people. I valued costs, she valued worth. And I had forgotten the difference." He looked directly at Alara, a clear, unambiguous acknowledgement in his eyes. "We are all here today because one person, Alara, did not forget. She held onto a promise. She reminded a son what his mother truly stood for. She did not do it for fame or for money. She did it because it was the right thing to do." He gave a small, respectful nod in her direction. "Thank you, Alara. You have given this family back its memory. You have given my mother back her voice." The recognition was perfect. It was specific. It was honest. It didn't try to paint him as a hero or her as a savior. It simply stated the truth, giving credit for the one thing that mattered above all else, her integrity. Recognition done right, agree. The families in the room, understanding the deep history behind his words, began to applaud. It started softly, then grew, a warm, heartfelt sound that echoed off the book-lined walls. It wasn't the thunderous, obligatory applause of a gala. It was the sound of gratitude. And for the children in that room, it opened a door to a future their parents had only dreamed of. Life at the Vance estate found a new, quieter rhythm. The great machine of wealth still churned, but now, a small, resilient gear of human dignity had been added to its workings. A few months after the first scholarships were awarded, Alara was walking through the main hall of the estate on her way to a board meeting. She paused. There, on the wall next to the grand official portrait of Eleanor Vance, was a new addition. It was the handkerchief. The original worn linen handkerchief with its faded blue EV had been professionally preserved. It was mounted against a simple dark silk background and framed in a plain, elegant frame of dark mahogany. It was lit by a single soft spotlight. It looked less like a memento and more like a sacred relic. Beneath it, a small brass plaque had been installed. It did not mention the foundation or the money or the scandal. It contained only 4 words, a promise kept. Alara stood before it, her heart full. She thought of the day Beatrice had held it with such contempt, calling it a rag. She thought of it lying on the floor, a symbol of her own dismissal. She remembered its scent unlocking Arthur's memory, its presence on the stage shifting the balance of power in an instant. The object hadn't changed, but its meaning had been utterly transformed. It had started as a symbol of a private bond, a shared, secret history. It was now a public testament, a permanent reminder of integrity, loyalty, and the quiet power of a promise. Did the object's meaning change for you too? It was no longer just her story or Eleanor's. It now belonged to the house itself, woven into its history. It was a quiet, constant echo, whispering to everyone who passed that the truest legacies are not built of stone and steel, but of small human promises, honored and kept. She smiled, a deep, peaceful satisfaction settling over her. She felt a quiet readiness for whatever came next, knowing that the past was now secure. The final image is one of quiet, sunlit continuity. It is a year later. Alara is in the library, the same room that once held the secret. But now the room is not a place of hidden documents. It is a place of open futures. She is seated in a comfortable armchair, not at a desk. Across from her, in a small circle, sits the first class of the Eleanor Vance Education Fund scholars. They are teenagers, their faces a vibrant mix of nervousness and excitement. One wants to be an engineer, another a nurse, a third a poet. They are the children of the estate's drivers, gardeners, and cooks. Alara is not lecturing them. She is not advising them or admonishing them. She is listening. With a gentle, focused attention, she listens as they talk about their dreams, their fears, the pressure they feel to succeed. She asks them questions not about their grades, but about their passions. This has become her role, her truest work. She is the keeper of the fund's spirit, ensuring it remains a place of human connection, not just a financial transaction. Her presence has changed the very atmosphere of the room. It is no longer just a space of wealth and power, but one of hope and potential. On a small side table beside her chair sits a single, framed photograph. It's a candid shot of her and Eleanor, years ago, laughing together in the garden. Next to it is a small silver vase holding a single sprig of lavender. These are the tangible signs of a legacy honored. One of the students, a shy boy whose father is one of the estate's chauffeurs, looks at her. "Were you scared?" he asks. "When you stood up to them?" Alara considers the question for a moment. "I was," she admits softly. "But I believe that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the belief that a promise is more important than your fear." She looks around at the bright, hopeful faces of the children. Your future was the promise. The room is still, filled with a quiet, powerful dignity. The legacy of Eleanor Vance is not the money in the fund, nor the plaque on the wall. It is this circle of listening. This simple, profound act of seeing the value in people that others overlook. The justice Alara fought for didn't arrive with a thunderous clap of revenge, but with the quiet, steady hum of possibility, echoing into a new generation. What quiet promises are you the keeper of? The room is changed, and it will stay changed.